Hi, my name is Elena Edgar, and this presentation will be my final media project for HK208 or Intro to Medical Ethics. So to start, I'm just going to give a brief introduction to my source and its credibility, as well as give a brief summary regarding the specific episode and the dilemma that I chose to talk about. All right, so to get started, as you can see, my media choice comes from a popular medical TV show called Chicago Med. Chicago Med is a TV drama that follows the lives and cases of the staff of a hospital located in Chicago. The show has aired on NBC since 2015 and was just recently renewed in March of 2024 for its 10th season. Um, I'll also mention that the episode that I will be talking about in specific was in season 5, which was ordered in February of 2019 and premiered in September of 2020. And then, as I've noted, since the show is a drama, there are bound to be inaccuracies in its portrayal of medical knowledge, hospitals, and hospital staff. With that being said, though, the show does highlight some realistic scenarios, including ethical dilemmas, like the one I'm going to talk about today, that could very well happen in real life. So, the episode that I have chosen to talk about is season 5, episode 6 of Chicago Med, and it is titled It's All in the Family. For a brief summary, Dr. Halstead and Dr. Crockett Marcel are teamed up on a car accident case involving a man named David Bridges who had a no blood card in his wallet, indicating that he is a Jehovah's Witness. And then I made a little tangent line here because I think that it's important to define exactly what is a Jehovah's Witness before we start to analyze the dilemma itself. So essentially, it's a Christian group with distinct beliefs and practices, a lot of which I've listed here, but the one with asterisks are the ones that we're going to see becoming relevant to this specific case. And those are they don't believe in the Holy Trinity. They believe or they regularly attend congregation meetings at a Kingdom Hall, and they refuse blood transfusions. So then getting back to the summary, while David is unconscious, his parents, who are devout witnesses, refuse to allow blood transfusion despite the doctor's warnings that David would not survive without it. Dr. Halstead suspects that David, who had been drinking, using drugs, and had a tattoo of the Holy Trinity, might no longer be a practicing witness. So then this dilemma ends up becoming one of patient autonomy and respecting religious beliefs, even when there is doubt and suspicion that they may have changed, versus beneficence or a physician's moral obligation to do good. And the way that it ends up resolving is Dr. Halstead shows the tattoo to David's congregation leader, who then tells him that David has not been to his Kingdom Hall in months. And when Dr. Halstead reveals this to David's parents, they leave frustrated and frightened. And by walking away, they leave David's autonomy in the hands of Dr. Halstead. So eventually, the blood transfusion is given, which saves Dave's life. However, when he wakes up and finds out that he has received the blood transfusion, he's incredibly upset and claims that he was going to repent and now had no chance. So now we'll move on to talking about moral philosophy within the case. First, I'll start by identifying the stakeholders. So the primary stakeholder, of course, is David because his life is actively at stake if he does not receive the blood transfusion. On the other hand, if he does, the integrity of his religious beliefs are at stake, and unfortunately, he is not conscious to decide which of these two are more important for himself. Similarly, David's parents have their son's life at stake, as well as the integrity of their faith. And then next, Dr. Holstead has his medical judgment at stake since he is the one that ends up being the decision maker on David's behalf. So if he makes the quote unquote quote wrong decision, that could really reflect on his medical judgment. Continuing on, Chicago Med holds stakes in ensuring that they follow legal and ethical guidelines in patient care. And again, if the quote unquote wrong decision is made, they could face legal liabilities as well as a shift in the public's view on the hospital. Then finally, I said the Jehovah's Witness community also has a stake in upholding the integrity of their religious teachings. So obviously there are two sides to this dilemma. The first one being that the most ethical decision is to disregard the no blood card, as David's recent behavior suggests that he may no longer adhere to the beliefs of a Jehovah's Witness. And I've listed the evidence for this side here, but I've also previously mentioned it, so I won't go over it again. And then the second side asserts that the most ethical decision is to honor the no blood card and respect the religious beliefs that David's family holds, as it aligns with both their past directives, or both his past directives and their faith. And then the main evidence for that side is that David listed his parents as an emergency contact less than a year ago when he was in the hospital for strep throat, indicating trust in them to make decisions on his behalf. And I didn't note it here, but the physical no blood card is also a large piece of evidence. As for where I stand, I believe that the most ethical decision would have been to honor the no blood card. Despite David's recent lifestyle changes, the presence of the card indicates that he still considers it relevant, and carrying it represents a clear and intentional decision about his medical care. Respecting that card upholds a principle of honoring documented patient preferences, particularly when there is not any concrete evidence that those directives no longer reflect the patient's wishes. So I believe if David had genuinely moved away from his religious beliefs, he likely would have taken the card out of his wallet or updated it somehow to reflect that new stance. Moving on, we are going to talk about ethical theories. So first is the utilitarianism perspective, which I put a little check mark next to because this case does in fact reflect it. The goal of utilitarianism is to create the greatest amount of good for the greatest amount of people. Administering the blood transfusion, despite David's religious objections and his parents' religious objections, would likely produce the greatest overall good, as it saves David's life and allows him to continue contributing to society. So, therefore, the decision to perform the transfusion is justified from a utilitarian perspective. Next, deontological, which means using your own intuition, values, thoughts, and beliefs. The doctors fulfilled their duty to save David's life, but disregarded his autonomy, values, and religious beliefs. A deontological perspective would have insisted that they also honor David's stated wishes, regardless of their personal judgment. Therefore, this perspective is not reflected. And then finally, we have a natural law perspective, which relies on letting nature take its intended course without intervention. So this viewpoint trusts that the natural process should unfold as it will, even if it means that David's life might be at risk. And so by choosing to intervene and perform the transfusion, the doctors did not follow the natural law principle of non-interference, and this perspective is also not reflected. Next, I'll talk about each of the four ethical principles, which ones apply and which ones don't, and I will identify which of them are at the heart of this dilemma. So first up is beneficence, which is one of the two key principles in this medical situation. Beneficence insists that physicians are morally obligated to help and that all decisions should be made with the intent to do good. Dr. Halstead's decision to administer a blood transfusion was made with the intent to save David's life in a crucial situation. They prioritized his immediate medical needs and believed that the transfusion was necessary for survival. So this does demonstrate commitment to the principle of beneficence. And then next is autonomy, or the right to make decisions about life and body without the coercion of others. This is the second key principle. So David had clearly expressed his wishes through the no blood card, which he was carrying in his wallet, indicating a commitment to the Jehovah's Witness community. This preference should have been respected to honor David's autonomy. Instead, though, we know that the transfusion was eventually given due to an assumption of his beliefs, or an assumption of a change in his beliefs. And obviously, David was not allowed to provide consent while he was unconscious. So the conflict between these two principles is what creates the medical dilemma in David's case. Autonomy emphasizes the need to respect his wishes that are expressed through his no blood card, while beneficence focuses on the doctor's obligation to act in the best interest of the patient by administering the blood and saving his life. Third, we have non-maleficence, which is the principle of do no harm. Non-maleficence is not a central ethical theory in this case, but it can be applied in a bit more of a complex way. So, while the doctors adhered to non-maleficence by doing no literal physical harm and giving the blood transfusion to save his life, they failed to consider the spiritual and emotional harm that it would have on David. As for David, the transfusion felt like a violation of his beliefs, and he ended up feeling disconnected from his faith. And then the final ethical principle is justice, which is the idea that all patients should be treated fairly. As I noted here, the principle of justice is not so applicable because the situation focuses on an individual decision making and personal beliefs rather than something like resource allocation or equitable treatment among a population. So the decisions being made are by the doctors and his parents, are centered around David's circumstances rather than broader societal issues. The next few slides are going to be about ethical concepts. We know that there are three categories: action-based, agent-based, and situation-based. So I'll be going through each one and analyzing whether or not they were followed. I'll start off by talking about the action-based concepts of consequentialism and non-consequentialism. I'm sorry. So consequentialism explains the rightness or wrongness of an action based on its consequences. So in this case, obviously there are two major consequences to the decision that was made. The good one, of course, being the preservation of David's life, and the bad one being his distraught state. So, although David was devastated to learn that he had received the transfusion from a consequentialist perspective, that emotional distress is outweighed by the preservation of life, or would likely be outweighed by the preservation of life. Then next, we have non-consequentialism, which, just like it sounds, the concept takes more into account than solely the consequences of a decision. For example, was the action well intended? Did it abide by moral duties? And with that being said, while Dr. Halstead's actions may have been well intended, they violated David's presumed autonomy and religious beliefs, and therefore they did not abide by moral duties. So this one was not followed. Moving on, we have the agent-based concept of virtue. Virtue relies on the actual character of the person making the decision and not the decision itself. So we can start to ask questions like, is this person acting with justice or charity or mercy or wisdom? And when looking at this case, we can tell that Halstead was acting with wisdom and mercy since he sought to save David's life by questioning the no blood card. His intention was to do what he thought was best for the patient. Whether he fully embodied justice, though, is debatable since he did fail to respect David's autonomy. And then finally are the situation-based concepts. So first is casuistry, which means using past cases or situations to establish moral principles for a current situation. A while back, I had mentioned that David had used his parents as his emergency contact less than a year earlier when he was treated for strep throat. This would imply that he has recently trusted them as decision makers on his behalf. And since David had not explicitly revoked their authority, the parents' decision should have been honored, and the ethical concept of casuistry was not followed. Next is relativism, which is dependent on a ton of factors, some of which could be time, place, situation, culture, location, etc. This situation was incredibly complicated and had an insane amount of evidence, making it extremely complex. So David's refusal of blood transfusion stems from his Jehovah's Witness beliefs. However, evidence of changing lifestyle suggests a shift in his relationship with those beliefs. Therefore, relativism would argue that doctors should consider that evolving context rather than adhere strictly to a universal moral rule. And with that being said, relativism was applied in this situation. Then finally, we have feminism, which puts priority on maintaining relationships. Dr. Halstead's decision to override the parents' wishes, despite his good intentions, would have likely and did disrupt the relationship between David and his family, as well as their faith in and their community within that faith. A feminist approach would insist that the maintenance of those relationships would be more heavily considered when making the decision. The last thing I will do to end off this presentation is go ahead and give a little bit of a reflection about this project and the source in general. So, like I said earlier, even though this show is dramatized for entertainment, there are scenarios that could 100% occur in any given hospital. For example, in real life, situations like David's could arise if a patient has deeply held religious beliefs that conflict with a doctor's medical recommendations. Then, as for my opinions on the show itself, I think that it is highly entertaining, part of the reason being because it is so dramatized. But when this project was introduced, I immediately knew that I was going to do an episode from Chicago Med. I've watched all of the seasons and I've really enjoyed it. And then tough cases like this one make the show even more interesting and engaging by keeping you on your feet. And then my final comment regards an alternative solution, but unfortunately, I do not think that I could come up with one. Since this was a life or death situation, I think that giving the blood or not giving the blood were really the only two ways that the situation could resolve. And of course, I have my opinion on which of those is morally quote unquote right, as I mentioned earlier, but I don't think that there's any sort of happy medium that would satisfy everyone involved and simultaneously save David's life. All right, that's it for my presentation. Thank you so much for watching.